Hi everybody. So the next poem that we're going to look at is War Photographer, and to make it a little bit easier for downloading, I'm going to divide the analysis of War Photographer into smaller videos, so hopefully it makes it a little bit easier for you to look at and download. So we're going to start with the context, a little bit of an overview, and I've just set out some of the things that I would advise that you take notes from as you're looking at this video, so that when this one's over you can complete these 4 sections. So you can see that we're looking at the context in the first video. We're going to have a look at who the poet is and the narrator that's within this poem, the topic of the poem, the intention and the tone. So this poem was written in 1987 and is not about a specific war, but rather about several conflicts that were going on at the time. So there are quite a few conflicts around 1987 that the poet is purposely referring to as a whole, the devastation of modern warfare. Okay, so if we have a look at the booklet, let's start here and see what we pick up on. So I'm just going to keep hold of my intention colour. Let's see what we find out first. So Carol Sachemurti is the poet, and she writes quite a lot about tragedy, specifically the tragedy of suffering in warfare. And she compares poverty and leisure, so they're things that we're going to look out for. So the author's known for facing pain and suffering head on. Quite a lot of her work actually is looking at psychology in writing and looking at that lots of painful topics such as war. The words of her poems centre around modern warfare, which we mentioned a second ago, and explicitly reveal the minor details of the effects of war on individual lives. So I think this is making me think of exposure a little bit. Minor details, the small things that maybe people don't talk about, the effects of war and the individual lives. So I'm hoping that what we're going to see in the poem then is that we're looking at we're zooming in on specific people and seeing the effects that war has. And it's rather than seeing the picture as a whole that perhaps Charge of the Light Brigade did, where it looked at the entire 600, maybe a little bit more like Exposure, where it's focusing on the individuals and the impact on them. Okay, so I've got a little bit of information there that's going to help me. Let's go back to here and see if we can jot a couple of things down. So the first thing that I would note down here is the poet is very interested in the psychology, the understanding of suffering and pain. So she writes about pain quite a lot, and is quite interested in the arbitrary nature of suffering. So you might have heard of this word a couple of times, but arbitrary means something that's illogical. It can happen to anyone, it's quite random. So the arbitrary nature of suffering, and obviously in reference to war and modern warfare. So that is her focus, and obviously she's writing about quite a lot about modern warfare, not a specific war, remember. So some of the wars that were going on at the time include Iraq and Iran. There were wars going on in South Africa, separate from the apartheid. The troubles in Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Sri Lanka's civil war, the second Sudanese civil war. So much going on at the time and an awful lot of conflict, and she's drawing on all of those devastating experiences when she looks at this poem here. So just to put this into perspective, you can see from the title that this is through the eyes of a war photographer. So this is who our narrator is. Remember, the narrator is separate from the poet. So this is the narrator through the eyes of a war photographer, what they see. So let's put this into perspective then. Show you a couple of images to see if you can get the idea of what she wanted us to focus on. So we've heard this phrase quite a lot, a picture can speak 1,000 words, and this poem is exploring the idea of what a photographer sees and also our reaction to it as well. So let's have a look at some of these pictures of war, of what war photographers might have taken pictures of. So we've got one here from South Vietnam in 1963. And I think when you're looking at the perspective of the war photographers, the narrator, what it would have been like to see that, and also as someone who may have seen this in the paper, how we react to seeing suffering is important, and she draws on that as well. So this is Syria in 2015. China in 1988. You can see the person here stood in front of the tanks. (1968) in South Vietnam. Remember who our narrator is. The person stood behind this frame. And the frame plays quite an important role in this poem as well. What we don't see, what's outside the frame, as well as our reaction to what's in the frame. And being in the position of standing there, taking that picture for others to see and not reacting or not jumping in, and the role of a war photographer comes into play there. 1993 in the Sudan. So this was during the Second Civil War. And this is a vulture here. Bosnia in 1992. So when we read this poem, we're seeing through the eyes of someone who takes pictures like these and reports on war. But we also get a contrast in this poem. So remember these, but we also get this contrast. And the poet intentionally contrasts with other images that a photographer might take to show you that it's not the entire story. So have a look at some of these that you might recognise that people do quite often, particularly on social media. So this is about what's outside the frame, and that's what this poet challenges. What do you not see? How we use pictures to sell something, represent something, tell a lie. So we're selling a story here, and you can see these pictures are selling a story or selling a view that is exaggerated, unreal, perhaps. And remember, this poem is playing with and asking what's outside the frame. Okay, so now that we've had a look at those, why don't you pause and see what you would put in here, and then come back and see if we get something similar. Okay, hopefully that you did pause. I'm going to jot down some of the things that I would hope that you noted down. So the poem topic, we've got a variety of wars represented. It's from a photographer's perspective. We've also got within the poem topic the challenge about what a picture tells us and doesn't, what a picture reveals, what it hides, and also our reactions. So plays quite a lot in terms of the intention with to make us question the frame. And when I talk about the frame, I mean the frame of a picture, so what's inside and what's outside. And to question the arbitrary nature of suffering. So who decides who suffers and who doesn't? And we get that contrast in the poem as well. And I think the tone is, it creates purposely this stark sadness and contrast, as well, as you'll see when we look at some of the imagery. So I think there's definitely a sadness here. I don't know whether there's a sense of responsibility as well as a war photographer about what you pass on, what you take a picture of. So maybe some responsibility. And obviously, because there's quite a lot of suffering, and that is contrast with some of the other lives that we're going to see, there might be some frustration or guilt. Okay, hopefully we've got a better overview of the context of the poem so that we can apply that to the macro in the next video.